Hello once again, this is Alistair, the Knight of the Orchards, and we're doing another recap of the latest episode of The Rings of Power. Because in this episode Numenor sort of takes centre stage, I thought I would talk a little bit about the depiction of Numenor here. And I have to say, I'm really quite impressed. They've managed to make a version of Numenor that sort of harks back to the depiction of Gondor in The Lord of the Rings, with the white cityness, the kind of architecture, and yet make it feel substantially different. Most obviously in the sort of, I guess you could say, Hellenic, Byzantine, Greek-inspired look of the court, and just in general, maybe even kind of a Iron Age type feel with the round bronze, or at least coloured bronze, shields, spears, and armour. There's something. It's sort of to me at least, and I'm not someone who's particularly well versed in kind of Greek or ancient Greek culture, but it feels like a mixture of all sorts of different kind of Greek stylings from the ancient period all the way through until the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. So visually, I thought it was really impressive. I liked that. I liked the nautical feel came through really well with that scene with Isildur as one of the sea cadets. And also just the overall, the references back to Gondor were also nice. I particularly like the references to Amon-Hem, in Fellowship of the Ring, when the Fellowship are going down the River Anduin and they see the statues overlooking the waterfall. And that obviously is referenced in the way that the statues are depicted as they're first coming into Numenor. I also liked how, despite the obvious straining of the relationship between the men and elves, Galadriel still speaks when she initially goes to, when she realizes they're going to Numenor, of Numenor with reverence. There is still this idea of Numenor as being a place of men and elves, even though that hasn't been the case for a long time. And it also reminds us that Galadriel is genuinely really old. I mean, she's lived through all of that period, so she probably still has some fond memories of Numenor, even if she'd never really been there herself. And that's kind of implied that she's not really been there herself. The kind of visual link to the Byzantine Empire I find interesting by itself, because it also kind of implies that this is sort of an empire, or at least a nation in decline, much as, although the Byzantines probably wouldn't have thought themselves that way, but after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the continuation of the Byzantine Empire is often looked upon as being sort of a sort of slow disintegration of a once great empire. And I think as we're seeing within Numenor in this episode, things are not right. All is not well, and I think we are about to see the downfall of Numenor play out either in this series or maybe even in the next series. So moving on from that then, I did want to talk a little bit about how they are mixing and remixing the lore of Numenor. Because they've taken an interesting tack here. A lot of the depiction of Numenor is roughly accurate to how it would have been in this time period in the Silmarillion, but there are noticeable things have changed. For one thing, Elendil was the scion of a great house of Numenor, and they sort of referenced that idea, but as in he was a noble house and is now a sea captain. But he was a lot more than the sea captain. He was very much kind of a noble, and downgrading him, as it were, to becoming kind of a sea captain is an interesting choice. I'm guessing they probably wanted some more characters that weren't of kind of noble birth, to sort of just, because they have a lot of main characters who are quite sort of from the upper echelons of society. So I guess it's nice to have a few that aren't. Also, Isildur is quite young in this. Because of course the men of Numenor don't age like regular men. So it's pretty clear from context clues in the Silmarillion that he is, a mature man at the point of the collapse of Numenor. And the gap between him and Elendil seems really quite big in terms of age, which again I'm not saying is wrong, but it's interesting. It's definitely a change from the Silmarillion. So this seems to be taking place in this what we're seeing now, the Rings of Power, seems to be taking place during the reign of Ar Palantir. I'm sure someone will correct me on my pronunciation there. Sorry, Tar Palantir. Tar Palantir was the last of sort of the good kings of Numenor. He was the second to last king, I believe, and he was the king that tried to move Numenor back towards the elves and back towards the Valar. After, as is referenced in the show, after the move away from the elves and the Valar under earlier kings of Numenor. And I'm not going to go into that, why that happens now. That's a subject for a completely different video. But it happens, and Tar Palantir attempts to push Numenorean society back towards the elves, the Valar, and and away from their corruption. And he ultimately fails, and the throne is taken by Tar Pharazôn, who ends up becoming the last king of Numenor, who is ultimately seduced by Sauron and ends up leading his people in a doomed attempt to destroy the Valar, which I'm sure will become a major plot point in either this season or the latter seasons. What's important about this is that they refer to the king as being effectively locked up for his support for the elves. And although they don't use the term Tar Palantir, presumably because it's in the Silmarillion, it's pretty clear that's who they're talking about. Interestingly, also, Tar Pharazôn is originally, in the Silmarillion, he is a sea captain of great renown. That's why he takes over the kingship. Whereas here, it seems like the advisor, the kind of vizier prime minister figure who's advising the queen consort appears to be, he's called Pharazôn, so I assume that is the same character. They've just changed it around a bit and made him more of a prime minister figure rather than a sea captain. Maybe because they're playing up Elendil's background as a sea captain, and wanted to make them more distinct. But yes, so overall, I think the depiction of Numenor is really good. I like it a lot. I think the visual depiction is great. The way they're showing the society is interesting. It's pretty clear that the Queen Consort is quite a sort of complex figure, morally grey figure, perhaps. And it's not entirely clear what she means when she gives Elendil that sword, but I think it means more than just to keep Galadriel under guard. So yeah, overall, I really like the depiction of Numenor, and I'm interested to see where it goes. My guess is that we won't see the downfall of Numenor proper until next season, because in order for that to happen, Sauron has to return and go to Mordor, which hasn't happened yet, or at least hasn't happened openly yet. So then, aside from that discussion of Numenor, we have 3 plot lines that are happening in Numenor at the moment, but I wouldn't say any of them develop particularly. We have, of course, Halbrand trying to settle in Numenor and failing. The whole scene where he turns into Indiana Jones for a second and becomes an action hero and beats up four men, that was silly. They didn't need to do that. He's not Aragorn. He's not Éomer. He might become a warrior king, but he certainly isn't now. So that felt silly. But the overall kind of form of that, what they were trying to get at, I understand. He's sort of he's the reluctant king. He's the man without a home. He's playing up and acting out because ultimately he doesn't fit in anywhere. And of course, Galadriel then reveals to us why. He was the king that served Morgoth. And I do wonder if they're going to tie that into the whole issue of the people who don't stand with Isildur, and who then later become the ghosts in the paths of the dead. That I wonder whether he or maybe a successor of his will play a role in that. But ultimately, his storyline, all we really find out is that he's ultimately the son of this old, descendant of this old king, and Galadriel wants to put him back on the throne. Galadriel's storyline is more interesting. I like how they've really obviously shown her flaws in this episode. She's not a diplomat here. She's a warrior. She's hardened, but also I would say somewhat internally hurt, and it's clear that she cannot stand the idea of being ordered around, even by her own king, Gil-galad, let alone by this woman that she's never met before. And it's really only Halbrand's timely intervention that sort of saves her and Halbrand from a considerably less good fate than they had with the 3 days of house arrest. Although, of course, we don't know how that's going to end yet. And yes, I like that she's more flawed. I also liked that she does warm up to Elendil. It's understandable that she sort of rejects Númenorian society, given that they are extremely bigoted towards her. But it also is nice that she warms up to Elendil, that she actually thanks him, and that she gains a better appreciation for what Númenor used to be, and perhaps at that point still could be. I think her budding friendship with Elendil is, to me, far more interesting than her relationship with Halbrand, who, honestly, I don't really care that much about. I almost feel like they should have just got rid of that character, frankly. Maybe I'll change my mind with later episodes, but at the moment, at least, I don't think he really adds too much. But Elendil and the kind of Elendil's family drama is genuinely quite engaging. I'm not sure what the actor's name is, but he reminds me a lot of Sean Bean's portrayal of Ned Stark. He has that kind of world-weary, father ultimately doing his best, but frustrated with his children's decisions feeling to him. And I think his relationship with with Isildur will be interesting. It's also not entirely clear what they mean by not going to the Western Shore. I know that in parts of the Silmarillion, the idea of dividing those of Númenor who stayed loyal to the elves and those of Númenor who did not, were divided into the different sides of Númenor. So I'm not sure if they're referring to that or if there's something else that's going on here. But either way, it's interesting that we're getting a glimpse into broader strains within Númenorian society. And Elendil, and also this issue with his brother Anarion. Again, it's not entirely clear what that's about, but it's probably going to be a retelling of leading up to the downfall of Númenor. So with Númenor to one side, the rest of the episode, I guess not too much actually happened. We had the Arondir and his imprisonment, which was fun and had some engaging action sequences. I do particularly like the way they've actually made the orcs fear sunlight. That was something that's nice to see again, rather than it being like in the Hobbit films where the orcs just do whatever they want, basically, in broad daylight, and nobody cares. But that was done well. The warg fight scene was nice. The fight scene with the elves. Overall, I think I quite like the more over the top action in the Silmarillion. Sorry, in the Rings of Power. Partly because it's a bit different to what was done in the Lord of the Rings, but partly also just because this is a more mythical period. It's a period of grand kings and magic and elves during the period of Middle Earth when things were more overtly magical. So having more over-the-top action sequences, I think, actually works quite well here. I wouldn't like it in a depiction of Lord of the Rings, but for the tone they're going for, the more mythical tone, I think it works well in the Rings of Power. But of course, honestly, nothing much happens with Arondir's storyline, except that his elven friends die, and he is taken to see, presumably, Sauron. I mean, it's pretty clear it's Sauron. So that's good. It does pretty much confirm, or at least seems to heavily confirm, that the Stranger isn't Sauron. I don't think the Stranger was Sauron from the second episode onwards, but I think this pretty much confirms the stranger isn't Sauron. Whatever he is, he's not aligned with Sauron. So that storyline, again, cool action set pieces, great makeup and effects, some good acting, but ultimately the story didn't really go anywhere and doesn't really need much extrapolation, except, of course, to note that it's clear that Sauron's plan is very much nearing fruition, and I expect in the next couple of episodes we will see the orcs come out a lot more openly. And finally, we have the storyline with the Harfoots, and again, not a huge amount really happened in this storyline, aside from the obviously Nori being found out as the person who was trying to help the stranger, the back of the cart issue, and then the strangers turning up and helping them to keep up with the rest. Ultimately, again, some good acting. I don't really have too much to say about the Harfoot storyline. Nothing really has particularly changed. I guess we'll see what the stranger finds out with the star map before. In terms of, I guess, kind of general individual points or sort of broader points that I thought were kind of noteworthy, I guess there's not really too much. I guess, from a visual perspective, I particularly liked the costume for the Queen Consort of Numenor. I thought the look with the earrings, the headwear, and the kind of shiny but very expensive looking clothing was, I thought it looked good, and I thought she did a good job at portraying this kind of regal but also quite conflicted and put upon figure who's clearly got a lot to deal with. Her revelation at the end that the elf had appeared seems like maybe there was a prophecy or something along those lines that is now things are now going to have to take shape. So be interested to see if Galadriel does manage to actually get off from Numenor without a fight. I doubt it. I doubt it. Oh yes, and finally, I guess the other thing I did like was I like how the orcs wear animal skulls. It's a small thing, but it helps make them feel distinct from the orcs in the Lord of the Rings, and it also makes them feel like less of an army or a military force, and just more makes them feel like a bunch of kind of scavengers and survivors who are now looking for a new person to lead them. It gives the orcs quite a different feeling from the orcs you see in the Lord of the Rings films. And of course, I think I'm right in remembering that you actually see an orc wearing a bone mask before the Harfoots come down during the Great Migration, which is a good way of kind of making the point that however much the Harfoots try and ignore the outside world won't ignore them, and that of course is a fundamental theme of the Lord of the Rings, the Gildor and Glorian saying to Frodo Baggins that you can fence the outside, you can fence yourselves in, but you cannot fence the outside world out, and that is seemingly going to be the same theme that they had for the Hobbits in Lord of the Rings, that they will have for the Harfoots in the Rings of Power. But yeah, so there we go. That's my initial thoughts on episode 3 of the Rings of Power. And yes, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Comment down below, like and subscribe, all that jazz. And I'll see you next week for the next episode. Goodbye.